Right after my wedding, my mother-in-law invited me to her home. I thought it was finally a peace offering. She smiled, cut the cake herself, and shoved it straight into my face in front of everyone. "You're just a gold digger who married my son for money," he shouted. The whole room went silent. I wiped the icing from my eyes and said one sentence that made her face turn white. "My name is Simone, and before I tell you what I said that day, you need to understand everything that led up to that cake. That icing dripping off my chin and the silence that followed. Because this isn't just a story about a mother-in-law who hated me on sight. This is a story about how far people will go to protect a lie they've told themselves for years, and what happens when someone finally hands them the truth on a silver tray. I grew up in a small town outside Springfield, raised by a single father who worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on. We didn't have money, we didn't have connections. What we had was each other and a kind of quiet dignity that I carried with me into adulthood like a second skin. By the time I was 28, I had built a career as a financial analyst at a mid-sized firm downtown. The kind of job that doesn't make headlines, but pays the bills and lets you sleep at night knowing you earned every dollar yourself. I met Thatcher at a mutual friend's dinner party. He was tall, a little awkward in the way that genuinely kind people often are, and he laughed at my jokes even when they weren't particularly funny. He worked in architecture, came from a family with old money and older opinions, and within 6 months I knew I wanted to spend my life with him. What I didn't know, not fully, was the storm I was walking into. Our first year of dating was, in many ways, ordinary in the best sense of the word. We took weekend trips to small towns neither of us had heard of before, cooked terrible meals together in his cramped apartment kitchen, and spent long evenings talking about the kind of future we both wanted, one built on partnership rather than obligation. Thatcher never once made me feel like the gap between our upbringings mattered to him. He would talk about his family's history, the property they had owned for 3 generations, the business connections Father had built over decades, but he always spoke of it with a kind of detachment, as though he understood it was inherited luck rather than personal accomplishment. It was only when he introduced me to his mother, roughly 4 months into our relationship, that I began to understand the world he came from. Operated by a different set of rules than the one I had grown up in, Bernice lived in a house that felt more like a museum than a home, filled with furniture that seemed designed to be admired rather than used, and portraits of ancestors lining the staircase like a silent jury watching every visitor who climbed those steps. She greeted me that first evening with a handshake instead of a hug, her eyes moving over my outfit with a precision that told me she was cataloging every detail for later analysis. The conversation at dinner that night set a tone that would repeat itself for years. Bernice asked about my education, and when I told her I had attended a state university on scholarship, she nodded slowly and said, "Well, that's certainly admirable," considering she never finished the sentence. Never clarified what she meant by considering, but the implication hung in the air, heavy enough that I understood it perfectly. I smiled, changed the subject, and told myself that first impressions could always improve with time. Thatcher's mother, Bernice, made her feelings about me clear from the very first dinner. She asked me in front of the entire table what my father did for a living. When I told her he was a mechanic, she smiled the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes and said, "How forceful of you finding a way out of that life." I let it go. I told myself she was just protective of her only son. I told myself a lot of things in those early years that I now recognize as excuses. Bernice had a daughter too, Thatcher's younger sister, a woman named Odalise, who presented herself to me as an ally from the beginning. She would text me little warnings, things like "Don't mind Mom, she's just old-fashioned," or "Give her time, she'll come around." I believed her. Trusted her. I had no reason not to because unlike Bernice, Odalise never said a cruel word to my face. She saved all of that for behind my back, and I wouldn't understand the depth of it until much later. The engagement itself was tense. Bernice insisted on planning parts of the wedding without consulting me, choosing a venue 3 hours from where Thatcher and I actually lived because it was, in her words, where the family has always celebrated. She made comments about my dress, my choice of flowers, even the small class ring I wore that had belonged to my late mother. Nothing was ever good enough, and everything I chose was somehow a reflection of where I came from rather than who I was. There was one afternoon about 8 months before the wedding when Vernice invited me to lunch alone. No Thatcher, no other family members. Just the two of us at a restaurant she chose without asking my preference. I remember feeling a small flicker of hope walking in, thinking that perhaps this was the moment she wanted to build something real between us. Mother to daughter rather than gatekeeper to outsider. Instead, she spent most of the meal describing in careful detail the previous women Thatcher had dated before me, each one apparently more accomplished, more refined, more suited to the life he was born into. She never said I didn't measure up. She didn't need to. The comparison did the work for her. I brought it up to Thatcher that evening gently, not wanting to create conflict between him and his mother so early in our engagement. He apologized on her behalf, told me she had always struggled with change, that his father's early passing had left her clinging tightly to the traditions and expectations she had built her identity around. I accepted the explanation because I wanted to believe grief could explain away cruelty, and because I loved him enough to extend patience I probably should have reserved for myself. Thatcher tried to run interference. He loved his mother and I understood that. I never asked him to choose between us, not directly, because I believed, foolishly, that time would soften her. I believed that once we were married, once the vows were said and the rings were exchanged, Bernice would finally accept that I wasn't going anywhere and that maybe, just maybe, she would let go of whatever resentment she'd been carrying about a daughter-in-law who hadn't been handpicked from her own social circle. There were smaller moments, too, the kind that are easy to dismiss individually but accumulate into something heavier over time. Vernice would introduce me to her friends as Thatcher's fiancée rather than by my name, as though my identity only existed in relation to her son. She once returned a wedding gift I had carefully selected for a family friend's anniversary, replacing it with something from her own preferred boutique without telling me, simply informing me afterward that she had handled it because she knew what that family would appreciate. Each incident on its own seemed almost too small to mention. Together they painted a picture I chose not to look at directly for far too long. The wedding day came in early autumn, the leaves just beginning to turn, and for a few hours everything felt like it was supposed to. Thatcher cried when he saw me walk down the aisle. My father walked me to him with tears in his own eyes, proud in a way that made the whole day worth it, regardless of what else happened. Vernice sat in the front row with a composed, unreadable expression. And I chose that day to believe it was the closest thing to approval I was going to get. During the reception, Bernice gave a toast that walked a careful line between gracious and pointed. She spoke about Thatcher's childhood, about the life she had envisioned for him, and ended with a line that most guests probably took as sentimental. But that landed on me like a small blade. She said she hoped I would grow into the kind of partner worthy of everything the family had built. A phrase that implied I had arrived unworthy, that whatever value I brought to the marriage, to be earned rather than already present. Thatcher squeezed my hand under the table when he heard it, a silent acknowledgement that he'd caught it too. But neither of us said anything that night. It was, after all, supposed to be a celebration. Odalis, for her part, spent much of the reception glued to my side, refilling my glass, complimenting my dress, telling anyone who would listen how happy she was to finally have a sister. Looking back, I recognize now how deliberate that performance was. Luckily, she positioned herself as my closest ally in that family, while simultaneously laying the groundwork behind closed doors for everything that would eventually unfold at her mother's dining table. 2 weeks after the wedding, Bernice called me directly, which she almost never did. Her voice was warm, warmer than I had ever heard it. She said she wanted to host a small gathering at her home, just close family to properly welcome me into the fold now that the wedding chaos had settled. She said she wanted to make things right between us. I remember hanging up the phone and telling Thatcher, with genuine hope in my chest, that his mother was finally extending an olive branch. I should have known better. I should have remembered every dinner, every backhanded compliment, every moment. She made me feel like an intruder in a life I had every right to be part of. But hope is a strange thing. Convinces you that people can change simply because you want them to. And I wanted that peace more than I wanted to protect myself from the possibility that it wasn't real, I dressed carefully that day. Not extravagantly, just thoughtfully. The way you dress when you're trying to show someone you respect them, even if they've never quite respected you. Thatcher and I arrived at Vernice's home to find it already full of family, more people than she had described on the phone. Aunts, uncles, cousins I had only met once or twice, all gathered in her sprawling dining room under warm lighting, with a beautifully decorated cake sitting at the center of the table like a centerpiece. Odalise greeted me at the door with a hug that felt, in hindsight, performative in a way I didn't have the language for at the time. She told me I looked wonderful, that this was going to be a great day, that Vernice had been talking about it all week. I remember feeling relieved. I remember thinking that maybe I had misjudged the extent of the tension, that maybe this family really was capable of welcoming me the way I had always hoped they would. Vernice approached the cake with a small silver knife in her hand, tapping a glass. To gather everyone's attention, she made a short speech about family, about tradition, about the importance of loyalty within the walls of her home. I stood beside Thatcher, smiling, genuinely moved, genuinely believing that this was the beginning of something better. And then she cut the first slice, walked toward me with it on a plate, and I reached out to take it. She didn't hand it to me. She shoved it into my face. The room went completely silent. I felt the cold, sweet mess. Icing sliding down my forehead, over my eyes, dripping off my chin and onto the dress I had chosen so carefully that morning. For a moment I couldn't see anything, couldn't process what had just happened. Could only hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, louder than anything else in that room. "You're just a gold digger who married my son for money," Bernice shouted, her voice carrying easily across the stunned silence of the dining room. She said it like she had been waiting years to say it, like the words had been sitting behind her teeth since the very first dinner, finally released with the force of something that had been suppressed far too long. I wiped the icing from my eyes slowly, deliberately, giving myself the time I needed to steady my breathing before I said a single word. I could feel every eye in that room on me. I could feel Thatcher tense beside me, could sense his shock, his confusion, the way his hand hovered near my back like he didn't know whether to comfort me or confront his mother first. I looked directly at Vernice, and in a calm, even voice that surprised even me, I said, "You should really check my salary before you humiliate yourself in front of your entire family, because I make more than your son does, and I have the pay stubs to prove it." Her face went white, not flushed with embarrassment the way you might expect, but genuinely, visibly pale, as though the words had physically struck her. Because the truth was, I had never told her what I earned. I had never brought it up. Never once used it to defend myself in any of our previous confrontations because I didn't believe my worth as a person or as her son's wife should be measured by a number on a paycheck. But in that moment, faced with an accusation so baseless and so publicly humiliating, I needed her and everyone in that room to understand exactly how wrong she was. What Vernice didn't know, what almost no one in that family knew, was that I had spent the past 3 years quietly building an investment portfolio. Side of my regular salary, consulting on the side for 2 other firms, and had recently been offered a senior analyst position that would nearly double my income. I hadn't told Thatcher's family because it never felt relevant to prove myself to people who should have loved me regardless. But standing there with cake dripping down my face, relevance stopped mattering. Only the truth did. The silence that followed was different from the first. It wasn't shock at what Vernice had done anymore. It was the slow dawning realization among the family members watching that Vernice had built an entire narrative about me when she had clearly shared with others behind closed doors, and that narrative had just collapsed in front of everyone who had ever believed it. Thatcher stepped forward then, his voice low but firm, and said something I will never forget. He told his mother that he was ashamed of her, that this wasn't the woman who raised him, and that if she couldn't apologize to his wife right then and there, he would leave her house and not return until she did. Vernice opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. For the first time in the years I had known her, she had absolutely nothing to say. I excused myself to the bathroom to clean the icing from my face and my dress, and it was there, standing alone in front of the mirror, that Odalise found me. She slipped into the bathroom under the pretense of helping me, handing me a towel with an expression of concern that I initially took at face value. But something in the way she spoke next made my stomach drop. "I tried to warn you," she said quietly. "But you should have listened when I told you to be careful about your finances around here." I asked her what she meant, and she hesitated just long enough for me to know that whatever came next would change everything. She admitted, almost casually, that she had been the one feeding Vernice information for months, telling her mother that I was secretly in debt, that I had pressured Thatcher into an expensive wedding venue against his wishes, that I had been asking questions about the family's assets and their vacation property in a way that suggested I was after more than. None of it was true. I had never once asked about the family's finances. I had, in fact, actively avoided the topic out of respect for boundaries I assumed the family valued. But Odalise had constructed an entire fictional version of me and fed it to her mother, piece by piece, week after week, cultivating the resentment that had just exploded across that dining room in the form of a cake to my face. The fabricated debt story, I suddenly understood, was exactly where Vernice's accusation had come from. In her mind, I wasn't just marrying into money. I was marrying into it while secretly drowning in obligations. I needed Thatcher's family fortune to escape. That single lie, repeated often enough, had been enough to convince Vernice that everything I represented was exactly what she'd always feared. I stood there, gripping the edge of the sink, the towel still damp in my hand, trying to reconcile the woman standing in front of me with the sister-in-law who had texted me encouraging messages throughout the entire engagement. I thought about every dinner where she had rolled her eyes sympathetically whenever Vernice made a cutting remark, every private conversation where she'd positioned herself as the one person in that family who truly understood me. All of it, I now realized, had been theater, a performance designed to keep me close enough to gather information while she quietly worked to ensure her mother never accepted me. "Did you ever actually like me?" I asked her, and the question came out steadier than I expected, given the circumstances. Odalise looked away, unable to meet my eyes directly, and gave me an answer that was somehow more painful than an outright confession of malice would have been. She said she didn't dislike me personally, that it had never really been about me at all, that I simply represented a variable in a calculation she'd been running for years about what would happen to the family's assets once her brother married. I wasn't a person to her in that equation. I was a risk to be managed. Asked her why. Why would she do that to someone who had only ever tried to be kind to her? And her answer was the kind of quiet, ugly honesty that only comes out when someone believes they've already been caught and has nothing left to lose. She said she had always assumed Thatcher would one day inherit the family's like property, and that she feared once he married, any future disputes over that property or any financial pressure within our marriage could eventually put her claim to it at risk. She didn't want to share it, didn't want to compete with a sister-in-law's interests down the line, and didn't want a stranger, as she called me, anywhere near decisions about land her grandfather had built with his own hands. It wasn't about money I currently had. It was about a future she had imagined, one where my presence in the family might someday complicate the inheritance she'd spent years quietly counting on. I left that bathroom with a clarity I hadn't expected to find. In the middle of what should have been the worst moment of my new marriage, I understood finally that this had never been about who I was. It had never been about my character, my work ethic, or my love for Thatcher. It had been about a fear so deeply rooted in Odalise that she was willing to poison her own mother's relationship with her brother's wife just to protect a property she didn't even legally own yet. Thatcher and I left that gathering early, but not before I did one more thing. Before we walked out, I asked everyone remaining in that room to stay for just a moment longer. I told them, calmly and without raising my voice, exactly what Odalise had admitted to me in the bathroom. I watched the same shock ripple across the room that had appeared when the cake first hit my face, except this time it was directed at someone else entirely. There was a pause before anyone spoke, the kind of silence that stretches just long enough to feel unbearable. An aunt near the back of the room, someone I'd only exchanged pleasantries with at previous gatherings, finally broke it. She said quietly, but clearly enough for the whole room to hear, that she had always found it strange how quickly Vernice's opinion of me had hardened. After the engagement party, Given how warmly she'd spoken about me right after first meeting me, that single observation cracked something open in the room. Suddenly, other relatives were exchanging glances, recalling conversations they'd had with Odalise over the months, comments that had seemed innocent at the time but now read entirely differently in light of what had just been revealed. Vernice, horrified by what she had just learned, turned to her daughter and asked if it was true. Odalise, cornered with nowhere left to hide, admitted it in front of everyone. The fabricated debt, the fabricated pressure over the wedding venue, the fabricated questions about the family's assets. All of it had come from her, engineered carefully over months to turn Vernice against me before I had ever done a single thing to deserve it. In the weeks that followed, I made a decision that surprised even myself. I didn't scream. I didn't demand apologies I knew would be hollow even if given. Instead, I did something far more effective. I simply stepped back. I stopped attending family gatherings. I stopped responding to the occasional text from relatives trying to smooth things over on Vernice's behalf. I let the silence speak for itself. And in a family that valued appearances and reputation above almost everything else, that silence became its own kind of consequence. Word travels in families like this one. Within a few months, extended relatives who had witnessed the cake incident began quietly distancing themselves from Bernice, uncomfortable with what they had seen and unwilling to pretend it hadn't happened. The annual holiday gathering she had hosted for over a decade saw fewer and fewer attendees. People began politely declining her invitations, citing conflicts that felt suspiciously convenient. Vernice, who had spent years cultivating an image of herself as the matriarch everyone respected, found herself increasingly isolated by a story she could no longer control. One cousin, a woman named Harlow, who had always been cordial but distant with me, reached out privately a few months after the incident. She told me that she had witnessed Vernice behave this way before, though never quite so publicly, toward a family friend's daughter-in-law years earlier, a woman who had eventually left the family gatherings altogether. Rather than continue enduring the slow campaign of disapproval, Vernice specialized in hearing. That helped me understand something important. I hadn't been an isolated target. I had simply been the first person willing to respond to that cruelty with something other than silence. That realization changed how I carried myself in the months that followed. I stopped shrinking in anticipation of the next slight. I stopped rehearsing polite non-answers to questions designed to make me feel small at work. My confidence translated into something measurable. I pursued the senior analyst position with the clarity I hadn't had before, walking into interviews without the quiet self-doubt that had followed me for years, a self-doubt I now recognized had been reinforced deliberately by a woman who benefited from my insecurity. Odalise fared even worse. Once her fabrications came to light, the trust she had built with other family members eroded quickly. She had, it turned out, spread similar manipulative stories about other relatives over the years. Small poisonous seeds planted here and there to serve her own interests. With the truth about me finally exposed, others began questioning things she had told them too, and one by one, the web of lies she had spent years weaving began to unravel entirely. An uncle who had once trusted Odalise with details about a difficult divorce discovered that she had shared those private details with other relatives, framing herself as a concerned confidant while quietly damaging his standing within the family. A cousin who had lent Odalise many years earlier, believing her explanation about a temporary hardship, learned that the story she'd been given bore little resemblance to the truth. None of these revelations came from me. I never went looking for further evidence against her. The family simply began comparing notes once the first crack appeared, and the more they compared, the more the pattern became impossible to ignore. Thatcher, for his part, distanced himself from his sister in a way that surprised even Vernice. He had always been the peacekeeper between the two of them growing up, smoothing over their disagreements, defending her when their mother was too harsh. But watching what Odalise had done, the deliberate months-long campaign to poison his marriage before it had even properly begun, broke something in that relationship that never fully repaired itself. They still spoke, still attended the same occasional family functions, but the closeness they once shared became formal, guarded, a relationship maintained more out of obligation than genuine affection. Thatcher, for his part, never wavered. He didn't try to defend his mother's behavior, didn't make excuses, didn't ask me to forgive and forget for the sake of family harmony. He simply stood beside me, consistently and without hesitation, in every conversation and every decision that followed. He told me once quietly that watching his mother humiliate me that day had shown him something about her he had spent his whole life avoiding, and that he couldn't unsee it now that it had been made so undeniably clear. A few weeks after the gathering, Thatcher drove out to Vernice's house alone, without telling me beforehand. When he came back that evening, he sat down across from me at our kitchen table and told me word for word as best he could remember the conversation that had taken place. He had asked his mother directly why she believed Odalai's story so easily, why she had never once come to him or to me to verify any of it before allowing her resentment to build for months. Bernice's answer, according to Thatcher, was that she had wanted to believe the worst because it was easier than confronting the possibility that her son had simply grown up and chosen in a life that no longer revolved entirely around her. Hearing that Thatcher told me was harder than watching the cake hit my face had been because it meant his mother's cruelty hadn't been a misunderstanding at all, had been a choice. Bernice did eventually reach out nearly a year later, asking to meet with me privately. I agreed, not out of any desire to reconcile, but because I wanted to close that chapter with my own clarity rather than leave it hanging open indefinitely. She apologized, sort of, in the careful, self-protective way people apologize when they're more concerned with their own reputation than genuine remorse. She said she had been wrong to assume things about me, that she had let herself be influenced by things she should have questioned more carefully. I listened to the entire apology without interrupting, and when she finished I told her something simple and final. I told her that I didn't need her approval anymore, that I never truly had, and that the version of myself who once hoped for her acceptance no longer existed. I told her that I would continue to be part of Thatcher's life because I loved him, but that our relationship, hers and mine, would exist only on the terms of basic civility from that point forward, nothing more. She didn't argue. I think in some quiet way, she understood that she had lost something the moment that cake left the plate and hit my face, something that no apology could fully restore. The power she had once held over my sense of belonging in that family was gone, replaced by a version of me that no longer needed her validation to feel secure in who I was or what I had built. As for Odalai's, the fallout from her fabrications cost her more than just her mother's trust. The other relatives who had once confided in her, who had shared family secrets and personal struggles believing she would keep them safe, stopped doing so entirely once they learned how easily she manipulated information for her own benefit. She remained part of the family in name, present at the occasional gathering. But the closeness she once had, the influence she once wielded, so carefully never returned. I think about that day often, standing in Vernice's dining room with icing dripping down my face, the silence of that room pressing in around me like something physical. I think about how easy it would have been to cry, to scream, to give Bernice the reaction she was clearly expecting when she chose to humiliate me in front of everyone she loved. But I didn't give her that. I gave her the truth instead, quietly and without theatrics. And it turned out the truth was far more devastating than any tears could have ever been. Thatcher and I have built a good life together since then, one that exists entirely separate from the approval or disapproval of the family that once tried so hard to make me feel small. My career continued to grow. I accepted the senior analyst position within months of that day, and the portfolio I had built quietly on the side eventually became a small business of its own. When I run alongside my full-time work, built entirely on my own terms and my own effort, we bought a small house together. The following spring, nothing extravagant, nothing that required anyone's approval or contribution but our own. I remember standing in the empty living room on the day we got the keys, sunlight cutting across bare hardwood floors, and feeling a sense of peace I hadn't realized I'd been missing for years. It wasn't the house itself that mattered. It was the knowledge that everything in it, every wall, every choice, belonged entirely to a version of my life that no one else had permission to define. My father came to visit us. Not long after we moved in, walking slowly through each room with the quiet pride of a man who had worked 2 jobs for decades so that his daughter could stand in a home she'd built with her own hands. He never asked about Vernice. He never asked about the wedding or the family, or any of the tension that had defined those early years. He simply told me, standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee between his hands, that he had always known I would be fine, that I had never needed anyone's permission to become exactly who I was meant to be. I think about that moment more than almost any other from that entire period of my life. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had never told the truth that day, if I had simply wiped my face, apologized for some imagined offense, and let Vernice's version of me stand uncontested in front of that entire room. I think about how many women stay silent in moments like that, swallowing humiliation to keep the peace, protecting relationships that were never truly protecting them in return. Chose differently, and I have never once regretted it. There's a particular kind of strength that comes from refusing to perform grief you don't actually feel, refusing to apologize for accusations that were never true to begin with. I didn't need to raise my voice that day. I didn't need to match her cruelty with my own. I only needed to stand still long enough to let the truth do what it always, eventually does, which is outlast every lie built to bury it. I still see Vernice occasionally at the rare gathering Thatcher feels obligated to attend, and our interactions remain exactly what I told her they would be that day in her sitting room. Polite, distant, entirely without warmth. She has never again tried to test that boundary. I think some part of her understood the moment I walked out of her house with icing still drying on my dress, that whatever power she once believed she held over my place in that family had permanently ended. What stays with me most, even now, isn't the humiliation of that moment or the anger that followed it. It's the clarity it gave me, the way one act of cruelty meant to break me instead handed me the exact evidence I needed to finally see the people around me for who they truly were. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives aren't the ones that destroy us. They're the ones that finally show us what we were dealing with all along, so clearly that we can never again talk ourselves into looking away. If you are in my position, standing in that dining room with cake on your face and an entire family watching to see how you would respond, what would you have said in that moment if this story moved you? Don't forget to subscribe to Valira Payback for a new story every single day.